All right, thank you, Carter, and thank you all for attending our Kansas City Community Gardens Friday workshop. Of course, many of you know we have these Friday workshops as a series throughout the growing season. This happens to be a new workshop. We have not offered this before. The reason is, well, really, because we're all gardeners, we kind of need to understand the nature of pollinators and beneficial insects in the garden. And of course, many of us, we see these, on a daily basis when we're out in the garden, but we really don't, we don't go beyond that. Some of these things we don't understand what the insects are actually doing. We just know, well, they're out there, they're buzzing around. In some cases, we might see them as a nuisance. But so this is basically for us gardeners, helping us understand what we can plant and how we can manage our vegetable gardens and our landscapes to be a little bit more pollinator and beneficial insect friendly. And so, yeah, like Carter said, you can enter your questions in the chat and he can answer them. And if there's some questions that are kind of outstanding that he can't get to, I'll answer them at the end. We'll plan on this presentation going for about 90 minutes, and then we'll answer all those questions at the end. Okay, so first off, kind of want to get down to what are beneficial insects. So yeah, what does that term mean? So beneficial insect, of course, sort of one of the poster children for this would be the honeybee. We all think about honeybees and their value to us, not only in pollinating a lot of our crops, but also they provide us, well, with that very sweet, sticky nectar that we love. Yet there are so many other different insects and different fauna out there that actually do a lot of pollinating. And so when you think about it, you think bees, wasps, butterflies. There are many species of flies that actually end up pollinating not only our crop plants, but just some of our native wildflowers and native plants. So we would consider those beneficial. Some of these also serve as pest control, as predator insects. So many species of wasps, and of course, a lot of people see wasps and they instantly go the other way, and in some cases for good reason. However, there are a lot of wasps that do a lot of pest control out there in the garden. There are lots of beetle species. For example, in the inset photo here, this happens to be a native annual plant that you see the little beetle on there. It's a little leatherwing beetle. And these are actually predator insects. However, they're mostly predator insects in their larval form. So they are actually out there eating other bad insects as a larval form. So little did you know that is a predator insect. Fireflies are actually predator insects too. And of course, there are spiders, which are not insects, but we know them to be predators and beneficial in the garden. And then there are other insects that kind of do these jobs that we don't really think about much, like decomposers. Beetles and ants are great at decomposing vegetation. We even think of the pill bugs, the roly-polies, actually do a good job of decomposing vegetation. And worms, which are not insects, but they're also great decomposers. So that helps set the stage on some of the fauna that is beneficial to us in the garden. Some of the other sort of beneficial larger fauna, of course, we think of birds. And birds do a lot of caterpillar hunting when they're starting egg production and the feeding of their young. And so when you think about these caterpillars, well, these could be the caterpillars that are on your fruit tree. These could be the caterpillars that are on your cabbages. So actually, birds in the garden can be a good thing. As you know, hummingbirds also, we plant gardens almost expressly for hummingbirds. But hummingbirds, they not only serve as pollinators, but they also eat small insects as well. So nobody ever thinks about a hummingbird taking a bite of a little gnat or something like that, but yeah, they do. Other things, bats. Bats are very elemental in the garden, and for what I do in growing fruit trees, definitely necessary, because bats, they fly at night and they eat moths. And of course, moths, as most moth species, fly at night. And some of those moth species are some of our major fruit pests, like oriental fruit moth and codling moth. So bats are very, very beneficial. And then there are other things like toads, skinks, snakes. Oh, didn't mention dragonflies. All of these too are beneficial in the garden. So with that, let's kind of talk about why should we end up planting for beneficial insects. Of course, like I said, like I mentioned earlier, honeybees. That's, that is a big thing. Although, if you think about the arc of history with the honeybee, they have not been around on this continent for all that long. 400 years or so. So the European honeybee was introduced. However, it's actually been of great benefit to us as a species, because it does serve as to pollinate so many different crops. Yet there are so many other beneficial insects that are pollinators, and they serve as pest control as well. So if you think about it, how would a number of our food plants actually end up getting pollinated? And you think about even some of our leafy greens. Well, what do leafy greens need to be pollinated for? Well, how do you get the seed for those leafy greens? It's through the actual act of pollination. So we really need to provide these habitats, these refuges for not only just honeybees, but all manner of bees, wasps, and flies that do these sometimes unseen tasks of pollination. And also, these are a very, very vital, very big part of a biodiverse ecosystem. When you think about our system now and our urban areas, and even a lot of our agricultural areas, there's a lot of lawn, there's a lot of monoculture agriculture. There is a lot of light pollution. Light pollution leads to decline in fireflies and some of the other night flying insects. Noise pollution. Noise pollution disrupts mating cycles in insects. And asphalt. There's not a comma there. Asphalt is not disappearing. I wish it were. But all of these things actually lead to a decline in plant material, and it leads to a decline in habitat. And so we are seeing habitat loss, and we're actually seeing a little bit of a crash in a lot of the pollinator species that we have. So really, the time to act, well, the time to act was probably years ago, but the next best time to act is today, to plant some of these gardens and to ensure we have good pollinator, good beneficial insect habitat. So let's look at kind of what plants make for good beneficial insect habitat. And a lot of this fits under the not all plants are created equal. However, a lot of flowering plants that have nectaries are going to be very beneficial. So when you think about how plants reproduce, a number of plants, they end up reproducing just through the wind. Corn is a prime example. A number of the grass species are an example. A lot of tree species are also a good example. You think oaks, for example, the pollen goes onto the wind, and that pollen goes off to fertilize a female flower, and then you get acorns. But in order to bring in insects and beneficial and pollinating insects, you actually need what are called nectaries on flowers. And these are actually at the base of the flower, and it's something that acts as this little sugary reward for many of these insects. And so it's very necessary to have plants that have those nectaries if you're going to be attracting pollinators and thusly some of these beneficial insects. So the nice thing is, it's probably not just happenstance, but many of our culinary herbs fit into this category quite well. And also many of our native Midwestern plants fit into this category. So we're going to talk about some of these plants and how they can help our insect populations, and at the same time, adding to your dried herb or your cupboards, and also adding to your garden. So let's also talk about some of the important species that are out there, and obviously this is a very abbreviated list, but just want to kind of bring some of these to your attention here. So the mason bees, and actually these are very important for orchardists, because these are a small bee that actually does a lot of fruit tree pollination when honeybees are still kind of in a little bit of their drowsy phase. Honeybees don't like to wake up until we start to get temperatures up in the 70s. However, some of these mason bees, they operate in sort of the 50, 60 degree range, and that's perfect when a lot of our fruit trees are flowering around here. So very important. There are lots of mason bee species out there, and many of them are native to the area. Squash bees. If any of you are growing any of the varieties of squash out there, squash bees are incredibly efficient at pollinating these squash crops. And seeing as squash is actually a native North American and Central American plant, a lot of these squash bees have evolved with the squash plant. So they are great at doing that. Of course, there are the honeybees. We already talked about them. There are things like the brackenid wasps. In particular, this one species that many of you have probably seen this before, that it parasitizes the tomato hornworm. And of course, the tomato hornworm is what you'll see that sometimes eating your not only the leaves but the fruit of your tomatoes. Turns out the hornworm is actually native, and the wasp is actually native. So those species have evolved together. This wasp has become a specialist, and it feeds just strictly on the tomato hornworm. So really interesting stuff there. There are also the ichneumon wasps, and they also serve as parasitizers. And then there are some of the kind of the more familiar wasps, like the thread-waisted wasps, that we'll often kind of see as mud daubers and things like that. but a lot of those wasps end up paralyzing caterpillars, which is great pest control in the garden. So what to plant for beneficial insects? And let's talk about herbs. Because as I mentioned, a lot of our herbs are really good for a lot of these pollinators and beneficial insects. And really these, the herbs that I'm mentioning here are going to be all perennial herbs. So we have the thymes, we have mints, we have anise hyssops, bronze fennel, which is the photo on the inset, oregano, lavender, chives, sages, and more. As it turns out, many of these species here listed are actually all within the same family, where if we take out bronze fennel and if we take out chives, all the rest of these are in the same family. It's the mint family, Lamiaceae. And as we go through this presentation, you'll see this repeated over and over, that this is one plant family. Granted, it is a large plant family, but it is very important to a lot of these beneficial and pollinating insects. So, time for pollinators. Yes, indeed. So I don't know how many of you grow this wonderful culinary herb. There are a lot of varieties of thyme out there that do very well in our region. This list of thymes is just a small list. I know of at least 17 different varieties of thyme that actually do well around here, depending upon your drainage, depending upon your site. But these are all ones that do very well. And the ones that I have asterisks there, I've more, especially honeybee activity has been noted on these varieties. And mother of thyme and English thyme are kind of the more common ones that we'll use culinarily. French thyme can be used culinary, is used also, and lemon thyme. Some of these others definitely have some different flavors associated with them. So English and mother of thyme are the kind of the common ones that you would know better. And then there are the culinary mints for pollinators, and just like the thymes, there are a lot of varieties of mint. And this is one thing. One of the insets on this photo, on the top photo, you'll actually notice there's a mosquito. There is a mosquito that is nectaring on the mint. So if you know mosquitoes, you know the male mosquitoes do not bite, so the male mosquito needs something to survive on, and they end up surviving on nectar. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're planting plants for mosquitoes here, but in the process of getting a picture of this other strange little butterfly, there happened to be a mosquito right there. So anyhow, to kind of bring a little bit more clarity to this, so with these mints, we have peppermints and spearmints and hybrids thereof, and the 50, 60, there are probably well over 100 different varieties of mints. People really like to breed them. But within this, the spearmints actually tend to pack more of a sort of nectar punch, if you will. And Kentucky Kernel and Mojito, which are both spearmint varieties, will just get covered. Mainly with bees, some pollinating flies, and butterflies as well. And here we have bronze fennel. So I don't know how many of you grow this as an herb. In some cases in the garden, it can be a little bit, you know, we'll call it thuggish because it gets to be a big plant. And in some cases, the seeds germinate. Well, they germinate pretty freely. However, this is a great plant if you want to bring in a number of those different wasp species. Oftentimes, especially this time of year, you will see a number of species, especially the some of the big blue wasps, the ones that are kind of, you know, really intimidating when they're buzzing around you. But this will constantly be visiting the nectar. And the thing is, these wasps are not just visiting for the nectar, they're also out there searching. They're also out there searching for different caterpillars. It also happens that this plant is one of the host plants for the native black swallowtail butterfly. So there's a relationship there. Our native black swallowtail feeds on plants in the parsley family, and it turns out that even though it's a native butterfly, it found that it had a liking more to some of these introduced European and Mediterranean herbs. And it's not uncommon for some species to move on to another species within the same genus or the same plant family. And that's what happened with the black swallowtail butterfly and why it prefers bronze fennel, or in some cases parsley, in some cases dill as well. And then we have culinary sage, and there are a number of varieties of culinary sages out there. But most of the culinary sages are good at bringing in bumblebees. And you'll find that they really like to nectar, and they'll nectar in the flowers, and the flower stem will kind of droop over as they're feeding on it. And then also we have the garlic chives, and here we see, no, this is not a monarch. This is actually a Viceroy butterfly. And you also see a number of the leatherwing, and they're up there just kind of slowly nectaring and mating, actually, on the garlic chives. So all of those were some of the perennial herbs, and that's not an exhaustive list by any stretch, but what I do suggest is some of those different thymes and mints. You do look into those. And at the end of the presentation, I have some good resources that I can share on where you can find some of these plants. As far as some of the annual herbs, there are good annual herbs for bringing in insects, but not really as many. And so I referred to dill earlier, dill, and I guess to a lesser extent parsley being more of a biennial. But just like the fennel brings in a lot of wasps. Borage, which if you don't know, borage is the flowers actually taste like cucumber, and it's a plant that is used not only for edible flowers, but also as the foliage is used as a medicinal herb. So borage brings in a lot of bumblebees. German chamomile brings in a lot of honeybees, and then summer savory, you'll see it loaded up with bees and flies. And a little bit about flies and pollination. We're not just talking house flies, the things that are kind of annoying that are end up on stuff that rots. No, these are a lot of sort of specialist flies. Some of these are actually parasitizing flies that they end up parasitizing other insects. And they're just out looking basically for nectar, and then they're looking for protein or something to lay their eggs in later. In some cases, nature can be a little bit brutal out there, but that is how pest control works some of these times. Okay, so now we're going to get kind of into the native plant realm. So we talked a little bit about the culinary herbs, and now I want to get into native plant realm and the plant insect connection and how that goes a little bit deeper. These are all slides here of various states of the monarch, be it the very young caterpillar on a milkweed species to 3 caterpillars on a different species of milkweed, to a chrysalis, to a full adult. And many of us know of the monarch and these migrations that go over generations of butterflies that have been going on for millennia. And we know of its plight and how actually it is becoming an endangered species. This is something that we are watching this happen in our lifetime. And so I want to point out, why we should be planting. Okay, there we go. All right, recording is back on. So anyhow, it's the beneficial insect native plant connection. And so I know we're skipping from herbs to native plants. However, you notice that the herbs are very good at bringing in these insects. The native plants are also very good at bringing in these insects. So what are native plants and why do they matter? I think that's the question that a lot of people have. So if you think about the region that we're in right here, Kansas City, we're at the confluence of a couple of big rivers. We're right on the edge of the eastern deciduous forest and the Ozarks, and we have the tall grass prairie all around us. We have had glaciation, from glaciers receding 10, 12,000 years ago, but there are periods of glaciation even before that. So these native plants have been there. They've lived through it. They've evolved through all of this. This is pre-European. This is so the plants have been here a while. These plants are unique to certain biomes and ecosystems. And because of that, many insects have actually co-evolved with these plants. So just as in the monarch, it is co-evolved to eat the leaves of the Asclepias genus, all of those butterfly weeds and butterfly milkweeds. Some insects, such as the blue sage bumblebee, it's developed so it can pollinate the blue sage native plant. So there are a lot of those insect plant connections that are very key. And it's those insect plant connections that we're trying to bring to the garden. It is in order to bring in these insects, you need to have the right type of food for them. And not just any plant can do that. And oftentimes a lot of our native plants can do that because there is that coevolution. Nope. So in regards to that, here at Kansas City Community Gardens, we do have our native plant insectary garden. And if you've been here, you've seen it. Right now, it actually is filled with mountain mint, black-eyed Susans. I would say mountain mint and black-eyed Susans and rattlesnake master are sort of the three that are in full bloom right now. So the reason we have this, this is basically a grouping of native plants, and it's separated a little bit from the garden, but it is a chance for all of these insects to just kind of come and meet. And the common goal there is they are all dining on nectar. They're all nectaring. Yet in some cases, some of these insects are saying, "Hey, you look like the insect I need to raise my young on. You look like a food source." And so there are these other relationships that happen. In some cases, with black-eyed Susans, with Echinacea, with the different milkweeds, you have specialist caterpillars or specialist butterflies that will lay their eggs on those plants, and those plants will then get eaten by those caterpillars. Well, those caterpillars will then be eaten by, let's say, a parasitic wasp. So there's a whole cycle of life that is happening in this garden. But the other thing about this garden is, in order for this garden to really be effective, this isn't the type of garden you end up cutting down right at the end of fall, or it's not a garden you really start cutting down until we get actually into the springtime. So one of the tenets of having one of these insectary gardens is you need to leave some of the foliage. You need to leave some of the stems. It is these stems that provide an overwintering refuge for a number of these different insects. If you think about how insects spend the winter, some of them spend the winter in various states. Some of them may actually be full adults, and they may just they may find a stem and they go through a little hibernation as such. Some of them may lay eggs in stems or lay eggs in bare soil or in wood, and the next generation survives either as these eggs or as these larvae. So it's very necessary, in order to build up a good beneficial insect population, to make sure there is overwintering habitat. And that is, if there's any takeaway here, I think that's maybe the biggest one. You don't need to, and you shouldn't clean up every little last bit of debris in your yard. There's a whole movement to leave the leaves in some cases, and that is important. It is those leaves, it is those stems, it is that access to bare soil that a lot of these native insects need. And so that is basically one of the guiding principles behind these native plant insectary gardens. So with that, let's kind of get into some of these plants and some of their attributes. So just as with some of the culinary herbs, some of these plants pack a little bit more punch than others. And as I mentioned earlier, the mint family tends to pack a lot of that punch. And so here in the insets, we actually have two different species of mountain mint, the Pycnanthemum species, Pycnanthemum genus, I should say. At the top is the white bracted mountain mint, also known as clustered mountain mint. Right now, if I were to go outside there would be thousands of different insects on them, representing probably 20 to 30 different species, all of them just nectaring off of this one plant. And the bottom inset is a close relative. It is the hairy mountain mint, Pycnanthemum pilosum, and it too brings in a lot of insects. It's so both of these, and there's actually one more species, the slender mountain mint, although I don't think it packs as much of a nectar punch, but both pilosum and muticum are really prized plants if you want to bring in a lot of good beneficial insects. And then there are things like the bee balms, Monarda, and it's called bee balm for a reason. Monarda fistulosa, which is the tall eastern bee balm, it brings you know that plant is in the garden because you could hear the buzz that's coming from it. You get lots of bumblebees and lots of honeybees that are attracted to that. Some of the other Monardas, like Bradburyana, because it flowers so early in the spring, it doesn't attract as many insects because most of the insect activity that we have naturally in our region is definitely geared towards more the warmer season. But then there's the Monarda didymas, and those bring in a lot of insects too. There are lots of different cultivars of Monarda out there, cultivars and hybrids. Many of those cultivars and hybrids are also good. They do have a lot of nectaries still in them. A little lesson on cultivars and hybrids. Some native plants, and actually a lot of native plants have been bred, selected, and or hybridized. And some of these selections or hybridizations have actually led to less nectar production, and so they end up becoming a little less beneficial to insects. So that's always something to take into account when you end up going to a garden center and you see some of these big mop head style hydrangeas or some of the mop head purple cone flowers out there. A lot of the time, the actual nectaries no longer exist in those plants. And that's just a process of breeding for more petals and less actual flower parts. So it's visually appealing to the human eye, but its functionality in the insect world has gone way down. So that's something that there's still a lot of research that's being done on cultivars and some of their impacts. Some of it's benign, but some of it is real. So if you want to dig deeper into that, you could. I've got some resources at the end of this. And then we have some of the things like blue sage, which is also in the mint family. And as I mentioned, that is it's a plant that we do have a specialist insect that's been found around here, the blue sage bumblebee. So here we have just a slender mountain mint with one of the Monarda didyma cultivars, and yes, both of these are excellent at bringing in pollinator activity. So some more plants that pack in the nectar, and the other family that is sort of really important here is the Aster family. Aster family is another large family. It's basically also known as the sunflower family. And there are lots of plants that are within this family. Lettuce, if you can believe it, is within the Aster family. Artichokes are also within the Aster family. So don't read too far into it, but there's a lot out there. Some of the species that are important for our talk today, though, would be some of the blazing stars, and that's what this inset is. This is the Pictostachya, the prairie blazing star, or tall blazing star. But they're the eastern blazing star and rough blazing stars that are out there too. These are not only great butterfly magnets, but they're also really important to a lot of different bird species. And if you remember early on, we were talking about birds and some of their relations to picking off caterpillars and being beneficial in the garden. When it comes fall, you have all of these seeds here, and you have all manner of small birds. I kind of refer to them as the LGB, the little gray birds, but chickadees, finches, and any number of them end up pulling the seeds out of here. Then we have the asters, and the main two that, well, the two that we have in our insectary garden are the New England and the aromatic aster. For our purposes, they're really important because they flower very late. So they flower in that September to really the first hard freeze. So last year we had them in flower in November. And this can be important, especially as we kind of sometimes get these warmer late falls, and we still have a lot of insect activity. You know, a lot of insects, they're driven by the temperature. And let's take honeybees, for example. They're going to be out when it's 70 degrees. Well, if it's 70 degrees and they don't have any nectar, they're wasting all of this time flying around for absolutely nothing. And so that's where the asters come in really handy. The same is also true for some of the goldenrods, because many of the goldenrods are nice and late flowering. Black-eyed Susans, another important one in the sunflower family. And then there are sunflowers, and I'm not just talking the annual sunflowers, although those are important, but there are over a dozen native perennial species of sunflowers. And granted, not everybody would want these in their garden because they tend to spread by root, and some of them will get to be 12 feet tall. However, if you have the space, they're not only a great nectar plant, they end up making a great bird plant later on. And here we have Echinacea, and commonly known as the purple coneflower. So these these are great for a number of different pollinating species and great for a number of birds. The main Echinacea species that we have around here are the purple coneflower, the pale purple coneflower, orange and narrow-leaved coneflower. If you go to a garden center, you'll see a lot of different hybrids, a lot of selections. I would say some of the hybrids, they still have the nectar value in them. However, some of the mop head style do not have the nectar value, and so really wouldn't serve well as an insectary and or a pollinator plant. And here we have yet another nectar plant. This is definitely one of my favorites, and you'll notice we have some of the big thread-waisted wasp there, and I'm not sure which species that is, but then flying in, getting ready to visit, is this other small little species of wasp, and then you have another species of wasp. So we have three different species just right here. not on, this is a great wasp magnet. And a very interesting plant in the garden. Now I see something even down low. That looks like a digger bee that's down low there. So these are incredibly important for bringing in, and as I mentioned earlier, wasps are such a good predator insect. So actually, it looks like we are going to wrap this up a little bit early, which means we have more time for questions. But some of the sources for these plant materials. So finding native plants can always be a little bit of a challenge, but there are some places that have been doing this for quite a while now. Missouri Wildflower Nursery, they have sourced all of their native wildflowers from seed that has been collected within Missouri. So you know that it is from the region, and which actually has great importance. So if you think about let's take the coneflower. That coneflower grows all throughout the eastern US and even a little bit west of here. However, there's going to be regional differences wherever this coneflower grows. And so if you have something that's been collected locally, or more of a local, what's called an ecotype, so a similar ecological region, the plant is better suited for the area. And so that's the nice thing about Missouri Wildflower Nursery. It's all been collected somewhat locally. City Roots and Green Thumb are some newer native plant nurseries, and I think they're doing a good job at getting native plants out into the community. As far as some of these other things, some of the herbs that I was talking about earlier, so strictly medicinal seeds, that's also gone by the business name Horizon Herbs in the past. You can find some of these hard to find medicinal and culinary herbs. So it's a very, very interesting company, just as is Richter's. And if you want some of those strange mint varieties, if you want banana mint, for example, you can find banana mint at Richter's, as well as probably 100 other varieties of mints. It can be a little tough to order because they are a Canadian company, but they do ship to the U.S. So I recommend checking them out. And then another one is companion plants, and they are also a very interesting company where, yeah, you'll find plants you never knew existed. And then some of these sort of insect resources. So the Xerces Society is a great resource for understanding pollinators and how to attract pollinators and some of these beneficial insects. And so these were a couple of books that they put out a few years back. I know they have a lot more resources now. This is becoming a very important, it's a kind of a necessary field of study, and it's a necessary act that needs to happen to save a lot of these insects, the beneficial insects and pollinators. And if you want to get more into kind of understanding the native plant relations around here, the Kansas Native Plant Society and the Missouri Native Plant Society, they both organize field trips. Uh-oh, somebody's drawing on me. And then Deep Roots, the formerly known as the Kansas City Native Plant Initiative. They're also an important organization. And if you want to know about native plant sales, you could actually go to the Deep Roots website, and they have they have a list of some of the upcoming native plant sales. So now I will say time for questions, and I will look in the chat first. Carter, do you have, is the list, do you have a lot of questions on the list?
I have a handful. I can read them off to you, or do you have access to that document?
Actually, if you wouldn't mind reading them off, let me get to what's in the chat first.
I had a question. Should I leave my herb garden foliage stems until next spring? I really like to neaten up the garden in the winter months.
Yeah, so I guess it depends on what herbs, and so what I would suggest, because that's the other part about this. I mean, there's a reason to have a little bit of a tidy, let's say, culinary garden. So if you have something like fennel and dill or oregano, I'd be inclined to actually cut it down in February. I've never been a big proponent of cutting things down in, let's say, November or December. Personally, I like a little bit of winter interest, and some of those taller herbs can help provide that. What I would say is, if you have a big enough herb garden, you leave some of those herbs to stand over the winter, and when you do cut them, and let's say you cut them in February or March, you leave some of the stems, and leaving some of the stems just in the garden. So let those stems decompose in the garden, but within some of those stems, you will actually have different larval compartments, and those larval compartments will be good. It could be. I won't say it's automatic, but you could have beneficial insects in there. So let's see. And that was one that was on your list there, Carter?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to go up to the top here, and okay. Oh, this was direct. Okay. Is it best to plant herbs and or native plants in the garden or close to it? Well, I would plant herbs in the garden, a lot of your culinary herbs. And in some cases, some of the native plants can go in the garden. I would recommend, let's say with something like mountain mint, having a patch of that right near the garden, because it does bring in so many beneficials, and it will just stay right there. It's, well, you know, it is in the mint family, so it will run some, but if you're tending to the garden, you can just keep it in check. I think it's about striking a little bit of a balance. And the thing with your garden is, if you end up doing a lot of spraying in your garden, I would not have your native plants right next to it. So now, if you don't do a lot of spraying, then yes, I would have plants next to it. But it can be easy for things to get a little bit out of control. So make sure that you just keep some of your plants in check. With native plants, if you're putting a native plant into sort of this newly tilled, really nice garden soil, it's going to take full advantage of that. The reason why a lot of native plants thrive in our clay is they're used to that kind of soil. Yet you introduce this fluffy, let's say, vegetable patch to them, they might get a little bit rambunctious. Now, I'm going to just go down the list. I have, after mint blooms, can it still be used for cooking teas? I know some plants bolt and become bitter, so wondering about my flowering mint. So it is best to get the mint before it blossoms. It will take on a little bit more bitterness as it's flowering and kind of after it's flowering. Also, the foliage itself is not nearly as tender. So it gets a little bit rougher. It gets harder to use. So it's definitely just almost with all herbs, cutting them and let's say in the case of mint or in the case of oregano, for example, cut them before they flower and dry them. But then leave some of the mint to just let it flower. And the thing with a lot of the culinary mints is, well, that's not a problem because you know how it spreads. So you could cut half of it and use for drying and leave the other half. Now the half that you cut will still put on new foliage, and it will still go through a flowering process. But it'll just be a little bit later. So I would cut your mint early, but leave some to flower. Can any of these herbs native plants be planted in shade or part shade? Right. Well, that's sort of a long answer. With most herbs, most of the culinary herbs, they are going to do better in full sun. And the other thing, for most of these plants in sort of a nectary, insectary, pollinator type situation, you can go out into any garden and in the full sun, you will see ample insect activity. Yeah, you get into the shade and hardly anything's going on. And so the insects are also driven to the sun, just as flower production is kind of driven to the sun. There are a number of native plants that will still do well and flower in kind of a partial shade situation. You just won't be bringing in the sheer mass of insect activity. I think of I mean, Culinary Sage, for example, is one that you can grow in partial shade, and it will still do fine. There are other things within the mint family that you can plant in a partial shade. Even some of the mountain mints, the clustered mountain mint, will work in a partial shade situation. However, you won't have that insect biomass the same way if you had it in full sun. So it's two questions here. And yes, you can grow. Well, you have the insect activity, not as much, but yes, you will have the insect activity. I found squash bug eggs on Culinary Sage that was planted near winter squash. Is that to be expected? Huh. Well, no. No would be my answer. And I don't know. The female squash bug was confused. Yeah, because normally when you see squash bug eggs, you see them on the plant. In particular, you see them on the undersides of the leaves. So I don't know what to owe that to. Maybe those are some genetic traits that we actually want to breed for, because if squash bugs start laying on sage, they won't have a food crop. Yeah, so I don't know what to say with that. Unexpected. Ah, okay, so this is a particular for, I have some herbs that I planted 2 years ago and just left them. They have never been pruned. Are they still good? Should I cut them down? Well, this is dependent upon the herbs. And so most herbs, most culinary herbs, you do end up cutting back either in the beginning of spring or the end of winter. So thyme and oregano. Yeah, thyme, most of so every winter thyme will kind of get some dead on it. Thyme is one of those things that's actually pretty forgiving, at least the herb thyme. It's so you will get a little bit of dead on it every year that you'll just go ahead and oftentimes with scissors, you will just cut back the thyme. Oregano, yes, you should cut that back to the crown of the plant, and otherwise you'll just end up with a lot of dead woody stems that won't offer you much of anything. So yes, you should cut those back. And let's see. Okay, so I think that's all the questions I have on the chat. Carter, do you have some other ones there?
I've got a question about seed packets. Do they deteriorate over time and over winter?
About seed packets.
Yes.
So as in, like one were to buy some seeds, and how long do the seeds last? Basically, is that the question?
I think that's the root of the question. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this is another one of those. It depends kind of answers. So if you store seeds in kind of cool, like a cold refrigerator, if you have them in a crisper, kept dry, cool and dry, in some cases you could put seeds in the freezer and they'll last. But it depends upon the species, upon the plant that you're trying to grow. Some seeds will dry out a little bit quicker than others, but I've had the same cucumber seeds from 10 years ago that I was able to germinate cucumbers off of them this year, and I bought the seed packet 10 years ago. So it all depends on how well you're storing your seeds. And I say some species are not going to store as well as others. A lot of the carrot relatives supposedly don't store as well. Some beans, if you're not careful with them, you can get a little bit of moisture in there and they can rot. So it does depend. But keeping them sort of a consistent temperature, not going back and forth from hot and cold, either keeping them at room temperature or keeping them dry in the refrigerator, they will last much longer. Do we have anything else?
I believe that's all I saw.
Okay, well, if anybody has any other questions, I think you could actually you could just go ahead and chime in if you want. Be happy to just answer it over the air. Melinda, email me, and I have a couple folks that in mind. Roly-polies, are they good? Are they good or are they bad? Well, it depends on the situation. So they actually, they're a decomposer. However, sometimes they can be problems if you have too many of them in the garden. Yeah, so in container plants, they're mainly eating dead materials in the container plant. And yeah, I get that. They can it can seem like you have an abundance in some of these containers. If they're not eating the plant itself, I would say they're not a problem, but if you're noticing a lot of them, you may need to end up pulling some of the plants out of the containers, repotting, if that's possible. I know this time of year it's not great to try to do that, but you may want to address the issue. All right, well, thank you all for attending, and let's all do a rain dance. We are, well, gosh, we're at about 25% of our rainfall for June and July right now. So we really need some moisture out there. So go water your trees, go water your garden, do a rain dance. Thank you all, and come by. Make sure to come by and visit our insectary garden and the beanstalk garden, and we will see you soon.